Vladimir Lenin Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Written, January, June, 1916. Source, Selected Works, Volume 1, pages 667-766. First published, early 1917. Online version, Lenin Internet Archive. Marxists.org. 1999. Transcription/markup, Tim Delaney. Preface to the French and German editions. Concentration of production and monopolies. Banks and their new role. Finance capital and the financial oligarchy. IV. Export of capital. V. Division of the world among capitalist associations. V. Division of the world among the great powers. V. Imperialism as a special stage of capitalism. V. Parasitism and the decay of capitalism. X. Critique of imperialism. X. The place of imperialism in history. Collected Works Volume 22. V. Lenin Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Preface. The pamphlet here presented to the reader was written in the spring of 1916, in Zurich. In the conditions in which I was obliged to work there, I naturally suffered somewhat from a shortage of French and English literature and from a serious dearth of Russian literature. However, I made use of the principal English work on imperialism, the book by J.A. Hobson, with all the care that, in my opinion, that work deserves. This pamphlet was written with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. Hence, I was not only forced to confine myself strictly to an exclusively theoretical, specifically economic analysis of facts, but to formulate the few necessary observations on politics with extreme caution, by hints, in an allegorical language, in that accursed Aesopian language, to which Tsarism compelled all revolutionaries to have recourse whenever they took up the pen to write a legal work. It is painful, in these days of liberty, to reread the passages of the pamphlet which have been distorted, cramped, compressed in an iron vice on account of the censor. That the period of imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution, that social chauvinism, socialism in words, chauvinism in deeds, is the utter betrayal of socialism, complete desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie, that this split in the working class movement is bound up with the objective conditions of imperialism, etc. On these matters I had to speak in a slavish tongue, and I must refer the reader who is interested in the subject to the articles I wrote abroad in 1914-17, the new edition of which is soon to appear, in order to show the reader, in a guise acceptable to the censors, how shamelessly untruthful the capitalists and the social chauvinists who have deserted to their side and whom Kautsky opposes so inconsistently are on the question of annexations, in order to show how shamelessly they screen the annexations of their capitalists. I was forced to quote as an example, Japan. The careful reader will easily substitute Russia for Japan, and Finland, Poland, Kurland, the Ukraine, Khiva, Bokhara, Estonia or other regions peopled by non-Great Russians, for Korea. I trust that this pamphlet will help the reader to understand the fundamental economic question, that of the economic essence of imperialism, for unless this is studied, it will be impossible to understand and appraise modern war and modern politics. Author. Petrograd, April 26, 1917. Preface to the French and German editions. As was indicated in the preface to the Russian edition, this pamphlet was written in 1916, with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. I am unable to revise the whole text at the present time, nor, perhaps, would this be advisable, since the main purpose of the book was, and remains, to present, on the basis of the summarized returns of irrefutable bourgeois statistics, and the admissions of bourgeois scholars of all countries, a composite picture of the world capitalist system in its international relationships at the beginning of the 20th century, on the eve of the First World Imperialist War. To a certain extent it will even be useful for many communists in advanced capitalist countries to convince themselves by the example of this pamphlet, legal from the standpoint of the Tsarist censor, of the possibility, and necessity, of making use of even the slight remnants of legality which still remain at the disposal of the communists, say, in contemporary America or France, after the recent almost wholesale arrests of communists, in order to explain the utter falsity of social pacifist views and hopes for world democracy. The most essential of what should be added to this censored pamphlet I shall try to present in this preface. It is proved in the pamphlet that the war of 1914-18 was imperialist, that is, an annexationist, predatory, war of plunder on the part of both sides, It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition and repartition of colonies and spheres of influence of finance, capital, etc. Proof of what was the true social, or rather, the true class character of the war is naturally to be found, not in the diplomatic history of the war, but in an analysis of the objective position of the ruling classes in all the belligerent countries. In order to depict this objective position one must not take examples or isolated data. In view of the extreme complexity of the phenomena of social life, it is always possible to select any number of examples for separate data to prove any proposition, but all the data on the basis of economic life in all the belligerent countries and the whole world. It is precisely irrefutable summarized data of this kind that I quoted in describing the partition of the world in 1876 and 1914 in Chapter VI, and the division of the world's railways in 1890 and 1913 in Chapter VII. Railways are a summation of the basic capitalist industries, coal, iron and steel, a summation and the most striking index of the development of world trade and bourgeois democratic civilization. How the railways are linked up with large-scale industry, with monopolies, syndicates, cartels, trusts, banks and the financial oligarchy is shown in the preceding chapters of the book. The uneven distribution of the railways, their uneven development, sums up, as it were, modern monopolist capitalism on a worldwide scale. And this summary proves that imperialist wars are absolutely inevitable under such an economic system, as long as private property in the means of production exists. The building of railways seems to be a simple, natural, democratic, cultural and civilizing enterprise. That is what it is in the opinion of the bourgeois professors who are paid to depict capitalist slavery in bright colors, and in the opinion of petty bourgeois Philistines. But as a matter of fact, the capitalist threads, which in thousands of different intercrossings bind these enterprises with private property in the means of production in general, have converted this railway construction into an instrument for oppressing 1,000 million people in the colonies and semi-colonies, that is, more than half the population of the globe that inhabits the dependent countries, as well as the wage slaves of capital in the civilized countries. Private property based on the labor of the small proprietor, free competition, democracy, all the catchwords with which the capitalists and their press deceive the workers and the peasants are things of the distant past. Capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world plunderers armed to the teeth: America, Great Britain, Japan, who are drawing the whole world into their war over the division of their booty. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, dictated by monarchist Germany, and the subsequent much more brutal and despicable Treaty of Versailles, dictated by the democratic republics of America and France and also by Free Britain, have rendered a most useful service to humanity by exposing both imperialism's hired coolies of the pen and petty bourgeois reactionaries who, although they called themselves pacifists and socialists, sang praises to Wilsonism and insisted that peace and reforms were possible under imperialism. The tens of millions of dead and maimed left by the war, a war to decide whether the British or German group of financial plunderers is to receive the most booty, and those 2 peace treaties are with unprecedented rapidity opening the eyes of the millions and tens of millions of people who are downtrodden, oppressed, deceived and duped by the bourgeoisie. Thus, out of the universal ruin caused by the war, a worldwide revolutionary crisis is arising which, however prolonged and arduous its stages may be, cannot end otherwise than in the proletarian revolution and in its victory. The Manifesto of the Second International, which in 1912 gave an appraisal of the very war that broke out in 1914 and not of war in general. There are different kinds of wars, including revolutionary wars. This manifesto is now a monument exposing to the full the shameful bankruptcy and treachery of the heroes of the Second International. That is why I reproduce this manifesto. This manifesto is not given as an appendix to this edition, and as a supplement to the present edition, and again I urge the reader to know that the heroes of the Second International are as assiduously avoiding the passages of this manifesto which speak precisely, clearly and definitely of the connection between that impending war and the proletarian revolution, as a thief avoids the scene of his crime. IV. Special attention has been devoted in this pamphlet to a criticism of Kautskyism, The international ideological trend represented in all countries of the world by the most prominent theoreticians, the leaders of the Second International, Otto Bauer and Company in Austria, Ramsay MacDonald and others in Britain, Albert Thomas in France, etc., etc., and a multitude of socialists, reformists, pacifists, bourgeois democrats and partisans. This ideological trend is, on the one hand, the product of the disintegration and decay of the Second International, and, on the other hand, the inevitable fruit of the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, whose entire way of life holds them captive to bourgeois and democratic prejudices. The views held by Kautsky and his like are a complete renunciation of those same revolutionary principles of Marxism that Ryder has championed for decades, especially, by the way, in his struggle against socialist opportunism of Bernstein, Miliband, Hyndman, Gompers, etc. It is not a mere accident, therefore, that Kautsky's followers all over the world have now united in practical politics with the extreme opportunists through the Second, or Yellow International, and with the bourgeois governments through bourgeois coalition governments in which socialists take part. The growing world proletarian revolutionary movement in general, and the communist movement in particular, cannot dispense with an analysis and exposure of the theoretical errors of Kautskyism. The more so since pacifism and democracy in general, which lay no claim to Marxism whatever, but which, like Kautsky and Company, are obscuring the profundity of the contradictions of imperialism and the inevitable revolutionary crisis to which it gives rise, are still very widespread all over the world. To combat these tendencies is the bounden duty of the party of the proletariat, which must win away from the bourgeoisie the small proprietors who are duped by them, and the millions of working people who enjoy more or less petty bourgeois conditions of life. A few words must be said about Chapter III, Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism. As already pointed out in the text, Hilferding, ex-Marxist and now a comrade in arms of Kautsky and one of the chief exponents of bourgeois, reformist policy in the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, has taken a step backward on this question compared with the frankly pacifist and reformist Englishman, Hobson. The international split of the entire working class movement is now quite evident in the Second and the Third Internationals. The fact that armed struggle and civil war is now raging between the two trends is also evident. The support given to Gorbachev and Denikin in Russia by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries against the Bolsheviks, the fight the Ski-Demons and Novskas have conducted in conjunction with the bourgeoisie against the Spartacists in Germany, the same thing in Finland, Poland, Hungary, etc. What is the economic basis of this world historical phenomenon? It is precisely the parasitism and decay of capitalism, characteristic of its highest historical stage of development, i.e., imperialism. As this pamphlet shows, capitalism has now singled out a handful less than 1/10 of the inhabitants of the globe, less than 1/5 at a most generous and liberal calculation of exceptionally rich and powerful states which plunder the whole world simply by clipping coupons. Capital exports yield an income of 8 to 10,000 million francs per annum, at pre-war prices and according to pre-war bourgeois statistics. Now, of course, they yield much more. Obviously, out of such enormous super-profits, since they are obtained over and above the profits which capitalists squeeze out of the workers of their own country, it is possible to bribe the labor leaders and the upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. And that is just what the capitalists of the advanced countries are doing. They are bribing them in 1,000 different ways, direct and indirect, overt and covert. This stratum of workers turned bourgeois, or the labor aristocracy, who are quite Philistine in their mode of life, in the size of their earnings and in their entire outlook, is the principal prop of the Second International, and in our days, the principal social not military prop of the bourgeoisie. For they are the real agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement, the labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, real vehicles of reformism and chauvinism. In the civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie they inevitably, and in no small numbers, take the side of the bourgeoisie, the Versailles against the communards. Unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and its political and social significance is appreciated, not a step can be taken toward the solution of the practical problem of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution. Imperialism is the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat. This has been confirmed since 1917 on a worldwide scale. July 6, 1920. Then, Lenin,